You don't even need a physical blow to your head to experience a concussion. You don't need to have lost consciousness. You don't need to see stars. And I actually think a lot of people out there who are struggling with their brain health, almost always I can trace back to some type of trauma where it was like an undiagnosed concussion or multiple over time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Josh Helman, and I'm really excited to be interviewing today one of my friends, Dr. Titus Chiu, who is a functional neurologist, an expert on concussions, trained as a chiropractor. And I've really been impressed by his depth and breadth of knowledge. So this is going to be an interview you don't want to miss. So Titus, how in the world did you get into studying and helping people with their brains? I mean, it's yeah. How did you get here?
So over 21 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident that nearly took my life. I was hit by a car on my way to work, and I ended up with broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and thankfully I was wearing a helmet because otherwise I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. But despite that, even though I survived, I ended up with chronic pain and the fallout from a concussion. And so I tried everything I knew within the conventional medical system to find answers, but unfortunately nothing worked. And so I decided to go outside the box, and I went back to school and I got a postdoc in clinical neurology. I got a master's in nutrition. I studied functional medicine, even like you said, studied chiropractic, acupuncture, energy medicine, anything I could get my hands on to find answers. And I am so glad that I persevered, because along the way, I applied a lot of the things that I learned in the conferences and, in school and reading scientific articles to my own brain. I tinkered with my, my own nervous system. And after many years of trial and error, I was actually finally able to fully recover from my concussion. And along the way, I learned and discovered a lot of insights, principles, and secrets to healing the brain and concussions naturally. And I began to share that with my patients and clients, and they started to get better as well. And I knew I was onto something. So I've made it my mission to empower as many people who are struggling with concussion and the fallout of concussions with the tools necessary to heal their brains so they can get back to feeling normal again.
That's amazing, Titus. And I just wanted to interject that this is a summit for Alzheimer's. And what I've realized, taking care of hundreds, thousands of patients with Alzheimer's is actually when you ask them any history of head trauma, they say no. And then when you get a PET scan of their brain and you see surface areas on the surface of the brain, it's like, it looks like you had a major trauma here. Are you sure you never had a trauma? Oh yeah, my mom dropped me when I was 2 on my head. So unfortunately, concussion and head trauma is very relevant for many Alzheimer's patients, which is exactly why I wanted to get you on this discussion. That is so
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Dr. Josh, because what I've discovered and what the research shows is trauma from untreated concussions can last a lifetime. And specifically when it relates to Alzheimer's and dementia, like research shows that even one concussion can more than double the risk for dementia, like years later. But the good news is, right, and we'll get to that, right? Those are, in my opinion, when I see the research, it's because these people went through their lives not knowing they had a concussion and therefore weren't given the tools to help with recovery. And that's the tricky thing, just like you had said in your example, working with your patients. So many times when I work with patients, and the majority of my patients, I would say 70% know they have had a concussion. So they show up to my office or they schedule an online consult. They're like, oh, I've been struggling with my symptoms months or years after my concussion, right? That's 70%. But then I would say about 30% just have these mystery brain symptoms like memory issues or problems with focus and concentration, right? And they come to me and they say, and I ask them in the history, I'm like, have you ever had a concussion? They're like, oh, never, right? But then we find, sure enough, when I explore their history in greater detail, right, I find out, I'm like, well, you just told me that after you had this car accident, 15 years ago, that's when you started noticing a change in your brain function, like a bit more brain fog, felt a little bit more scatterbrain, and it just it seemed to just get worse over time, right? And they'd be like, yeah. And that's the thing. You don't even need a physical blow to your head to experience a concussion. You don't need to have lost consciousness. You don't need to you see stars. And I actually think a lot of people out there who are struggling with their brain health, either early stages of dementia or even before that, pre-Alzheimer's types of symptoms, almost always I can trace back to some type of trauma, right? Where it was like an undiagnosed concussion or multiple over time. So yeah, absolutely. Although I specialize in concussion, my whole journey healing my brain and discovering the underlying root causes for things like concussions also lend itself and are linked with the underlying root causes for things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's very much related. And many of the patients I work with who've had concussions, they know they've had concussions, also have a family history of dementia or Alzheimer's. Right. And so they reach out, they're like, I'm having problems with my, brain function, I'm having slight memory issues. Overall, I'm managing, but I am terrified to, go down the fate that my mom did. Right. And I want to do whatever I can to prevent. So, and that's the thing when it comes to prevention, a lot of times because Alzheimer's typically develops over the course of 20 years, right? It's like,
or more.
yeah, or even more, right?
Yeah.
And, a lot of the times that's the thing. And I can totally relate. If something's not front and center, we're not going to take action, right? But I've learned, again, through my struggles with concussion and also having a family history of Alzheimer's, it's like, I know when I recovered from my concussion and I did all the things that I did to heal from that, I moved that slowly moving ship that was headed towards the direction of Alzheimer's, right? Just slowly, 20, 30 years in advance. And so that's why I love working with people who get that. It's just like, I want to do whatever I can to prevent this from ever happening. And the great news is, as you know, there are so many things you can do about that.
Wow. And I definitely want to get to those. But before we get there, can you talk a little bit about what you think causes Alzheimer's? And you also told us that people can have a concussion without head trauma. How would that work?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second question first. So, right, when we talk about a concussion, it's when you have injury to your brain. Okay. And that's the thing. Your brain, it exists in this fishbowl we call your skull. It's actually floating around in what's known as cerebral spinal fluid. Right. So it's floating around, moving around. So that's the thing. I've had patients where they fell off a bicycle, they landed on their outstretched arm, they didn't even hit their head, and then boom, the forces from that fall traveled up their body and then shook that brain in that fishbowl around, causing a concussion.
So in that example, even if they didn't necessarily break their hand or wrist, the force can still be transmitted from the arm up into the brain. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And I've had patients, for example, like I described before, they had a whiplash. They didn't hit their head on the steering wheel, but the force of the movement was enough for their brain to go back and forth, sloshing around that fishbowl, causing a concussion. I've even had patients who've been on a roller coaster, and just the forces of that was strong enough to, travel up their body into their skull and create a concussion. So yeah.
And before you put that brain down, let's just talk about.
Yeah. Don't put the brain down, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes,
that's the number one message.
Because the one thing you don't have there is you don't have the bony, hard skull that brain normally and should be sitting in.
Exactly.
And so, if it was it was being cushioned by air or your hand, no, that's not the way it is. It's protected, but unfortunately,
but it's floating around. Exactly. And so strong enough, I mean, blows even to the body, right? Like you don't even have to hit your head. That's the thing. Number one. Number two, you don't need to lose consciousness. I didn't lose consciousness in that car accident 21 years ago, but sure enough, I had a concussion from that. So
Wow.
yeah, so that's the reasons why, even without a blow to your head, you might have had sustained a concussion. And then in terms of that, when we talk about like underlying root causes, right? That's the thing, majority of doctors out there, including neurologists, are just like, well, we think there might be a genetic component, but we really don't know why it happens. Whereas, I know many speakers at the summit, there are actual underlying root causes. There is a physiological imbalance happening at the core level, right? I love the analogy. It's kind of like, when you wake up one day, 30 years down the line, when, 30 years prior, you have like a little hole in your roof, right? And then, yeah, maybe the floor is a little damp. It's easy to wipe it up. It's manageable. Fast forward 30 years later, it's all of a sudden in your bedroom is flooded. You're like, how did I get here? Because there been accumulation of that hole or multiple holes growing, right? So my point is, I think one of the reasons why the conventional approach to Alzheimer's just doesn't cut it, and that's not my opinion, it's fact, a lot of the medications out there just don't work. It's because they're trying to patch up the holes and the symptoms, right? Versus addressing the underlying cause as to why is that hole there in the first place. And so through all the research I've poured over, as well as working with patients with concussion and healing my own brain, I found that there are a lot of different root causes, but there's three big ones that I've seen when you start to fix them can really help patch up those holes. The first one is blood sugar imbalances, right? And so the research shows that's why people call Alzheimer's, some researchers are calling it type 3 diabetes, because
Right.
that speaks to the influence that blood sugar imbalances and issues with insulin sensitivity can have on the brain and nervous system, right? And as you know, in addition, when you have changes in blood sugar and insulin, metabolism, all of that, it leads to then the second thing, which is inflammation. And so the second big root cause I see for, that can increase a person's risk for Alzheimer's is inflammation. And finally, the third one is stress. Believe it or not, mental, emotional stress can increase the risk for Alzheimer's, because when you're under stress, whether it's mental or emotional, your brain perceives that stress and it sends a signal to what we call your hypothalamus, which is buried deep within your nervous system. So I'll blow up the brain for our viewers out there. So buried deep within your nervous system is what we call this area, the hypothalamus. Your brain perceives stress, tells the hypothalamus, hey, something's going on that we need to deal with. The hypothalamus then passes a signal to what we call the pituitary, which then releases hormones that communicate with our adrenal glands. Point being, when our brains perceive stress, we release these stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And that's important because it helps us deal with the stress and it helps us get out of bed so we have energy to face our day. But the problem is, and actually the same thing goes for inflammation, which I'll dive into deeper in a second. The problem is when that stress gets stuck in the on position. And honestly, one of the reasons why I see that happen is either due to chronic stress or stress from trauma. When we experience trauma like a concussion, our nervous systems, this area we call our brainstem, can get stuck like in the hyperactive state, triggering a massive stress response, and then we get stuck in this vicious stress cycle. Point being, when our blood vessels are, and bloodstream is flowing with excess cortisol and stress hormones for many months or years on end, research shows it actually shrinks key regions of the nervous system related to memory and focus, the two key areas in that are signatures of Alzheimer's dementia, the prefrontal cortex, right? As well as what we call the hippocampus, which is this area of our nervous system that's buried deep within again. So point being, chronic stress leading to excess stress hormones like cortisol, scientific research shows that it can literally shrink the areas of our brain that are related to memory, focus, as well as the risk for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. So yeah, those are the three big ones. Again, there's a ton more, but I find that when people start balancing blood sugar, you start getting a handle on their stressors, as well as decreasing inflammation. And I think that's one of the biggies. And again, not even my opinion. If you actually look at the definition of neurodegenerative diseases, right, including Alzheimer's and dementia, it's like this progressive disease process that we have no idea why. But even in the actual, right, when you look into the research, it's actually, well, there's a theory that mitochondrial dysfunction and inflammation, when it's there, that's actually why a lot of people and researchers, scientists, and more, enlightened doctors, that's why they think that these processes are neurodegenerative, meaning continuing to progress and get worse. So the great news is when you can start to address the inflammation and the stress, reset the nervous system, and balance blood sugar, sometimes just those simple things can already slow that disease process, sometimes stop it. And depending on how serious it is, how long it's been going on, how long you've had holes in your roofs for, sometimes even reverse the process, right? Through the miracle of what we call neuroplasticity, the amazing ability of your brain to literally change its shape, structure, and function and strengthen weakened connections and patch up the holes in the ceiling and the roof. Through the miracle of neuroplasticity, I've learned that healing is possible, even with things like concussion, right? Even with things like early Alzheimer's and dementia.
That's amazing. And, I'm just reflecting that it's a very different discussion when I'm talking to most normal neurologists, as opposed to a functional neurologist like yourself, who's willing to look at the root causes and then do something about it. I mean, I find patients often have much better results with the functional approach.
Yeah, right. Because it's all about asking that question. The way I look at it, it's like with conventional neurology. And by the way, right, I have total respect for the emergency room doctors and practitioners. I think conventional medicine, when it comes to emergency care, shines, right? Like when I was hit by that car and taken by way of ambulance to the emergency room, I'm so grateful for the people that showed up in the ambulance that took me there. I'm so grateful for the doctors and the nurses in the emergency room making sure I wasn't going to die. But then, so don't get me wrong, right? I think there's a time and place for everything, but I was literally left at the curb, both literally and metaphorically, just left at the curb to then fend for myself in all the fallouts from that concussion. So yeah, that being said, the way I look at like conventional neurology, it's kind of like answering the question, what? So this person has all these different symptoms. What do we call it? AKA, what is the diagnosis? Right. But as you know, being an expert in the brain and the holistic integrated approach, more importantly, then once you have a common language, you want to ask why, right? Why do you have a conglomeration of those symptoms, right? Why are you struggling? Why do you have that diagnosis? And what does that actually mean? Because when you can answer the question why, you're closer to identifying what that root cause is for you.
Right. And just to be clear, in my experience, and I bet for you too, in many, and actually the majority of cases, it's not just one or two root causes. It may be a combination in different percentages in different people of a dozen different underlying causes.
Absolutely. Yes. So personalization is key. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why the conventional approach pretty much has failed, because they're looking at the surface layer versus asking the question why. It's what's the root cause, because the root causes will be different for people. If I've worked with patients who had like early mild cognitive decline where their memory started to go a bit, they tended to be a bit more forgetful or scatterbrained. And I've worked with many patients like that, right? I was like that, in the stages of my concussion recovery. And what I've learned is, even though the symptoms look the same, right, the underlying root causes for that one person to the next sometimes is completely different. And so if you try to apply the same cookie cutter treatment, like one drug to one diagnosis, and especially for something as complex as the brain and Alzheimer's, you're gonna end up, hitting these dead ends. But the great news is, right, there is a lot of new understanding as to why these things happen, right? And then when you start to understand why they happen, then there's so much you can do about it, right?
Right. And one of the concepts you're famous for popularizing is the leaky brain. Explain what a leaky brain is and what that means.
Yeah, great question. So going back to those roofs, the holes in the roof, right? We talked about blood sugar, we talked about stress and the inflammation, and inflammation being a biggie. So what leaky brain is, when you have a leaky brain, your brain pretty much gets stuck in this inflammatory vicious cycle, right? And so what I found leaky brain to be the number one most overlooked root cause for things like dementia, Alzheimer's, as well as the slow recovery from concussion. And so what leaky brain is, going back to our brain model here, right? We talked about the skull. So thank goodness we have a hard skull, like some harder than others. Right? We have this hard skull that protects our most precious and sacred organ, our brain and nervous system, from external forces. Like imagine if you're just walking around without a skull, like any little thing could totally trigger, destruction to your brain. Like, so the point is we have this outer covering called the skull. Then we also, underneath that, a little bit deeper underneath that, we have all these different, what we call the meningeal covering. And then, so the purpose of those things are protection, right? Protect us from external forces, internal forces. On top of that, though, we have what's known as the blood-brain barrier. So all throughout our body, we have these different barriers. The most obvious one is our skin barrier, but we also have our lung barrier. We have the gut barrier, which many people know about, and we have the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, two main functions. Again, number one is protection, and then number two, selective passage. So let's unpack the first one. So protection, right? The blood-brain barrier, what it does, it protects our brains from internal forces. What do I mean by that? So as we sit here right now, Dr. Josh, and everyone watching right now, flowing through our blood right now as we speak, there's countless toxins, there's inflammatory chemicals, there's perhaps like pathogens floating through our bloodstream as we speak. And that's the thing, because our brain's so sensitive to things like that. Our nervous system, and through this whole process, has developed this protective layer surrounding your blood vessels, right? So right now, like I said, imagine like you have this garden hose like flowing all throughout your brain, which you do, carrying blood and vital nutrients to your brain. But there's also things that we don't want to get to our brain as well. And that's what the blood-brain barrier does. It protects our brain from things entering that shouldn't get there, right? In addition to that, so that's the first thing, protection. And like I said, the second function is selective passage, because we also have good things like glucose and nutrients and oxygen, right? And so the blood-brain barrier is pretty wild, because it's like the single cell layer made up of endothelial cells and proteins we call tight junctions, as well as astrocytes, which are really important brain cells related to detoxification. Point being, there's all these different components that make up the blood-brain barrier, and it's actually a living, breathing, dynamic organism in and of itself. It's made up of cells. And so there's a wisdom of the brain and nervous system. When things are balanced, it'll actually open up a bit and allow these substances that we want to come in. So things like oxygen and glucose and ketone bodies and other nutrients to fuel our brain. And then the flip side is, at the same time, once the brain's used all that stuff and metabolized, then there's actually a toxic buildup. There's like waste products. Well, guess what? By way of the blood-brain barrier and what we call aquaporin 4 water channels connected to what's known as the glymphatic system, related to, it's a fancy term for our brain's waste disposal system, right? Right. By way of the blood-brain barrier and these water channels, through selective permeability, it then flushes the gunk out, right? So again, protection, number one, and selective passage. So that's the main function. But the thing is, like I said, that blood-brain barrier is made up of a single cell layer, right? Endothelial cells, very thinner than a piece of toilet paper, right?
Right.
Thinner than a tissue. And so it's very susceptible to micro tears due to things like concussion or trauma. But on top of that, research also shows that it's also very susceptible to inflammation or toxins. And so what I found is, right, like I said, the importance of this blood-brain barrier, when you have a tear of that thin layer, imagine it's like this barrier, like a wall protecting your brain from your internal craziness going on, right? It's protecting that. If it starts to break, right, then that protection starts to go south, and things that normally shouldn't get in can get in. Bacteria, viruses, toxins, even your own immune compounds, we call cytokines and antibodies, could enter the nervous system and trigger a massive alarm reaction, leading to what we call neuroinflammation. Right. And that's the thing, though, what I mentioned before, you end up seeing this vicious cycle because you have, right? So say, for example, what happened to me many years ago in that car accident, I didn't know about leaky brain at the time, but when I look back, it's just like, oh my goodness, I had a severe case of leaky brain after that car accident. And I realized that over the course of many years, I was never fully recovered from that because of varying degrees of leaky brain, right? And so the leakier my brain, the more I was turning my ship towards this future of dementia and Alzheimer's, right? And so everything I did kind of like piece it together. And when I discovered leaky brain and really started to focus on fixing that, that's not only when my concussion got better, but I also know without a doubt, looking at all the risk factors for Alzheimer's, I started turning that ship around, right? And so what I was saying is, and this isn't even my opinion,
Right.
as you know, right? There's so much science that backs us up. Leaky brain is the gateway to not only dementia and Alzheimer's and what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the end game of untreated concussions, but also serious neurological conditions like MS, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, increased risk for stroke, and on, right? So when I was like researching and I discovered leaky brain and I use it to fix my brain and help my patients with concussion, I realized it was like Pandora's box. I'm like, oh my goodness, not only is it important for concussion recovery, I think it's one of the most important overlooked reasons why people end up developing Alzheimer's and dementia, right? Because when you have that leaky brain, like I said, it triggers inflammation within your nervous system that can then spread throughout your entire body, triggering things like leaky gut. And guess what? Then leaky gut can then cause further inflammation back into the brain, causing more leaky brain, right? So it's this vicious inflammatory cycle that people get stuck in. Again, if some people have trauma or not, right? Start experiencing things like brain fog, right? Start experiencing like memory slips and maybe not sleeping very well.
Right.
Or people who've had concussion or trauma, it's like they have these ups and downs with their symptoms and flare-ups, and they're like, I have no idea why. And many times it's because of leaky brain.
Right. So Titus, for someone watching this or listening to this right now, how do they know that they may be concerned now that they have leaky brain? How can they find out if they have a leaky brain or not?
Yeah, great question. So the cool thing is I've actually, number one is talk to a professional that understands the signs and symptoms. So some of the clues that you might have a leaky brain are some of the things I described. You experience brain fog. You're experiencing what we call brain fatigue or neuro fatigue, where when you use your mind, maybe even watching this video, trying to process all this new information, you start to get a bit tired, right? That's a clue that you might have leaky brain. In addition to that, I find a lot of people who are more sensitive, like either to lights or sounds, like if they're on screens too long, they start to feel funny or symptomatic. That could be a clue. If you've had a history of concussion, and hopefully now we've expanded your understanding of concussions, maybe even some type of other physical trauma, that's a clue that you might have leaky brain. And definitely if you've been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease, like early Alzheimer's or early dementia or whatever, again, research shows that when there is a leaky brain, that's one of the first gateways that starts to break down, leading to all these different things. So those are some common clues, and that's the thing. Whenever I talk to my patients, that's what I'm always listening to. In addition to that, the great news is, even though, that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book about leaky brain, because I realized not many people knew about it, right?
Right.
Including a lot of doctors.
Yeah, people have heard of leaky gut. Leaky brain is not on the radar.
Yeah, exactly. And I would imagine many people probably watching this, yeah, you're right, probably heard of leaky gut. It's been out in the research for many, many years now. I know back in the day when it was first coming out, it was like this fringe naturopathic thing. Now it's like hard science. It's like, duh. So one of the reasons why I made it a mission to educate people about leaky brain, because I think it's honestly, I think more important than leaky gut, especially when it comes to brain health, right? It's all connected, right? Like I said, you can have a leaky brain that causes leaky gut. And as we know, you can also have a leaky gut that can cause leaky brain. But number one, not many people know about it, and it's not their fault, because number two, their doctors aren't telling them about it, right? And that's the thing. When I actually look back, it's like, I remember when I was going through school, reading Kendall and Schwartz and all those neuroanatomy textbooks that a lot of my friends used as paperweights and book or door jams.
Door stops, yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I use that as a pillow because I wake up and read that, yeah. And I remember reading about, through all the texts and stuff briefly about the blood-brain barrier. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And even then, there wasn't that much research, right? But like I said, through my struggles and the suffering I went through healing my brain and concussion, when I discovered that, for some reason, it just resonated with me. Wait a second, there's got to be something here. And when I did a deep dive and I'm like, oh my goodness, and I uncovered, like I said, Pandora's box, it wasn't just concussion, it's all these other things. It's like, I need to share this with the world, because I really think it's like I'm envisioning 10, 20, 30 years from now. My hope is that people leaky brain starts to become a word, especially when we talk about Alzheimer's, dementia, and more importantly, prevention, right? Because the great news is, no matter how leaky your brain might be, there's a lot of things you can do to heal it. But yeah, so point being, back to your original question,
right?
There's clues like different symptoms I described, but also there's actually more advanced technologies where you can measure leaky brain, right? The unfortunate thing, many of them are invasive, involve a lumbar puncture, like a needle in your spinal, right? Or expensive MRIs. But what I found is actually there's newer technologies, simple blood tests that you can do in the comfort of your own home that could give you a clue as to the risk of your level of leaky brain, right? And so that's one of the things that if I suspect in my patients who've had concussions or maybe symptoms of early, memory loss or brain fog, that's one of the first things that we check for.
That's great. And we've talked a lot about root causes, maybe diagnosis, obviously about leaky brain. What are some of the things that people can do or you can help them with to fix the problems?
Yeah, and that's the great news, right? Leaky brain, when I tell people about that, they're like, what? Oh my God. I remember I told a friend of mine, and he put his finger in his ear because he didn't want that leaky gut. Like, oh no, it sounds scary, doesn't it? Right? And rightfully so, because it is connected and linked with all these serious neurological diseases. But the great news is, like I mentioned before, that blood-brain barrier, it's like a living, breathing, dynamic organism in and of itself. And just like everything else within our brains and bodies have a wisdom, right? And healing is possible. And that's the thing. Many cases, leaky brain actually heals on its own, right? But for me, because of the extent of that concussion, and I actually had several other ones afterwards, and then at the time, I didn't know anything about food sensitivities or toxins, and I didn't have the best lifestyle practices. I was continuing to damage my own blood-brain barrier, causing leaky brain, right? But again, we don't know these things until we know. Point being is, the great news is many times it heals on its own. But research shows there are actually simple things. I found sometimes simple things you can do at home to help support that healing process. The first one is exercise.
Hmm.
There's actually 2015 scientific journal article. They studied mice with leaky brains, and they found that simple aerobic exercise actually helps strengthen the blood-brain barrier. Now, obviously, most people on this call, except for the mice watching this, are like, I'm not a mouse. But as you know, Dr. Josh, right? The nervous systems of mice are a great way to understand the nervous systems of us as human beings. But there's also other research out there looking at, human studies in exercise. So yeah, simple exercise can actually help strengthen a blood-brain barrier that's not leaky, and it can also help a leaky blood-brain barrier get stronger and heal, right? So, and that makes sense, right? Because we know exercise increases antioxidant capacity, it decreases inflammation, it causes the production of BDNF to help protect your brain, all these different benefits. And on top of that, right? Stronger heart, meaning better blood flow, so on and so forth. So, yeah, step number one, move your body,
Yeah,
right?
and that's exciting that it's something so simple, right?
So simple. Yeah, and it's like I think back on, some other research I came across, people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's and memory issues, they were just given exercise, like walk for 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, and it helped with their symptoms. That's one of the reasons why, is they were helping to strengthen and heal their blood-brain barrier, stopping leaking brain, and ending and breaking that vicious inflammation cycle. So yeah, exercise is number one. Number two, sleep, right? I had mentioned a second ago, kind of when I was rambling about all the different
Sure.
things happening in the brain, but I mentioned the glymphatic system, which is the waste disposal system of our brain. And that's when we removed gunk from our nervous systems that build up over the course of everyday life, right? Point being, when you get good, solid, deep sleep at night, guess what? You are flushing that toilet. That's when the glymphatic system comes to life and all the workers come out and scrub, and clean up the brain and help to detoxify the brain. So the second thing is sleep. So really focusing on sleep. Now, the thing is,
And I think they're related, right? I find that if I exercise a lot, I sleep better.
yeah, exactly. That's the beautiful thing, is a lot of times when I work with my patients, they're like, oh my goodness, there's so many things I need to do, right? And I'm like, don't worry, like with our testing, we can hone in on what's most important for you. But on top of that, it's all connected, right? We start to break these vicious cycles by installing one simple thing at a time, like you said, exercise, right? Then it can help improve sleep, right? And actually, just a pro tip for everybody out there. So I found that people who do have sleep issues at night, a lot of times, obviously the first go to many doctors prescribe are sleeping pills. But as you know, you don't get that deep restorative healing sleep then, right? It helps you shut eye, right? And sometimes that's necessary just to get you by. But more importantly, right, when we talk about issues with sleep, even if you start to change your sleep habits around evening, that's step one. I find what a even better approach, because sleep is part of a whole circadian rhythm, 24-hour cycle. I find that people who have issues with sleep, you don't want to start in the evening. You want to start changing what you're doing in the morning, right? And there's a lot of research shows that people who have low, like actually too low levels of cortisol, could increase their risk for dementia and Alzheimer's as well. And I see that a lot in lab testing I do. And when I see that, one of the best things that people can do, like for example, if you are a snoozer, right, and the alarm goes off and you snooze and snooze, and when you get out of bed, it just takes you forever to kind of get your gears rolling. One of the best things you can do, not only to get your gears rolling, but it also can probably help your sleep and lower your risk for serious disease in the future, is within 5 to 10 minutes of getting up, you get out of bed. Step number one. Step number two, you walk outside. And then step number three, you just do light exercise while looking into the natural light from the sky, right? And when I say step 1, 2, and 3, that could be over the course. If you've been snoozing for many years, step number one might take you a few weeks to just sit up, is within 5 minutes, right? So it's just one step at a time. But I guarantee if you continue this process, research shows that you start to reset that circadian rhythm in the morning, it's going to have profound effects for you, not only to help you with sleep, but also lower your risk for developing serious diseases in the future. So yeah, number 2 is sleep. All right. So number 1, exercise, move your body. Number 2, sleep. And finally, number 3, upgrade your diet. So research shows, again, that the blood-brain barrier is very susceptible to inflammatory chemicals.
Right.
And one of the most common sources of that is from the food we eat. An example is seed oils or vegetable oils. And I remember learning about this years ago, and I'm like, I thought these things were healthy, right? So things like sunflower seed oil, cotton, right? And, all these different canola oils. The reason why they're so bad for our brain and blood-brain barrier is because they're really high in omega-6 fatty acids that can trigger inflammation throughout the brain as well as the body. So yeah, that's one tip. By upgrading your diet, you can help heal and strengthen your blood-brain barrier. And the flip side of that, avoiding seed oils, but the flip side is embracing the healthy fats. So things like omega-3 fatty acids found in, flaxseed or found in fish oils or wild-caught salmon. In addition to that, those are like the omega-3s. Then you also have the omega-9 fats that are found in good amounts in like olive oil or avocados, right? Even saturated fats can be pretty good for you depending on your genetics and, what your body does best with. So things like medium chain triglycerides found in coconut oil has been shown to really help people when it comes to things like memory, Alzheimer's, and dementia. So yeah, there you go. The third thing is diet. So simple things, just like we're talking about, Dr. Josh, right? Exercise, sleep, and diet.
That's awesome. And I'm just being nosy here. Do you, when you're working with patients or people, do you have similar conversations with them, or do you have like a whole team of people and you have an exercise person? What is it like in your world?
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So a lot of times what I do, I've actually created programs, like video programs where I walk people through these lifestyle rituals, these wellness rituals to help them install, right? And so a lot of it I do with, myself. Like in the past, I actually used health coaches and stuff. That was before the pandemic and we moved. But anyways, the point being, yeah, it's really important to have like people or practitioners who at least understand this stuff and can help people. So in my process, when I work with patients, right, I play several roles. I play the brain health detective. I help them identify what their root causes are, and I craft a custom design protocol, right? But which might look at different botanical herbs, supplements, diet changes. But then when we talk about things like exercise and sleep, right, they need that coaching and they need that support and encouragement. And that's one of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of doctors make. They say, oh, if they even say this, they're like, oh, yeah, you need to exercise more and stress less.
Okay.
And then the patient's like, okay, I kind of already knew that. How and where do I get the motivation and encouragement? So a big part of what I do with my patients and clients too is I act as a coach, right? And so they watch these videos of these different things that I help personalize for them in addition to their protocols, right? And it gives them that, encouragement. And then when I show up, I touch base to make sure that they're doing things correctly and not doing them wrong. And then also act as a coach and encourage them. It's like, yeah, I'd love it if we can get you waking up within, as soon as the first snooze goes off, right? Sitting up, getting out of bed, right? And so those are the things that I help support my patients to. Because again, yeah, at the end of the day, it's like there is these advanced treatments that I also use in my practice, like photobiomodulation, vagal nerve stimulation, infrared sauna, so on and so forth. Those treatments are very powerful and effective. But what I've learned, even with the best treatments, which could jumpstart a brain, get it working better, if there aren't those lifestyle rituals, those brain wellness rituals installed, then the brain starts to go south again. So yeah, absolutely. When I work with my patients, I wear a lot of different hats.
Okay, great.
Brain health detective, a coach, right? And, all those different things.
Yeah, and you have to, because in my experience, for example, talking about diet, when the average person I talk to, 90% of people I talk to say they already have a healthy diet. And I'm sorry, but we know that's not reflected in the data. I mean, people are deluded.
Yeah, and I get it. It's like my sense is that, when I talk to my patients, they do the best they can with the information. And you're absolutely right. It's like a lot of times where I'll be talking to my patients, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I got the best diet in the world. I've been doing this. And I'm like, well, I mean, that's pretty good. But, you've gotten rid of gluten and you're doing pretty good with that. But what about those aquaporin containing foods that could be damage your blood-brain barrier? Like we identified this through lab testing, and these supposedly healthy vegetables are actually triggering inflammation in your brain. So again, it's like they did the best they could with the information they had, depending on, the other doctors they work with or, watching videos like this
Right.
and summits. And so I find a lot of the times it's like that testing is so valuable because then you can get really personalized and reveal these hidden triggers and things that are harming their brain. And a lot of times it's still, yeah, I get it. It's like it takes time to make changes. It took me many years to get to where I'm at with not only my health, but with the rituals that I've installed. And so that's why when I work with patients, again, it's like I'm the brain health detective, I'm the diagnostician, but I'm also the coach because I've been there. I get it both not only physically, but also the mental, emotional components as well.
That's great, Titus. And I'm sure it varies from person to person, but how long until people start seeing results? Because that's probably what they're thinking. It's like, yeah, I want to do these things, but when is this going to kick in for me?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So typically when I work with patients, like usually what we do is we put the upfront work at the start, meaning if we can identify the root causes, right, the holes in their roof, right, and we personalize a plan that's just right for them, many times I see patients experience benefits and start feeling better within like a week or two. I mean, back in the day, and I still do this. We do these intensive treatment days where people fly in. Sometimes we do work together for 2 or 3 days straight, like long days, but we get a lot done. Sometimes within a matter of 2 or 3 days, people are feeling like 40, 50% better already, right? This huge jump start. And
That's
then we
great.
continue the process at home and we continue again, dialing in the supplements, the lifestyle, and I coach them through that process. But yeah, I mean, that it's remarkable. Again, contrary to popular belief, a lot of doctors think that once there's trauma, once there's damage to the brain, it's irreversible. Not only has that been not my experience, but that's also what the science shows. Healing is possible. And sometimes I've seen remarkable changes happen after only a couple days, right? Or a couple weeks on a protocol. But again, it's really important to continue with that, building in, installing those habits and the rituals to maintain that over time.
That's amazing, Titus. So I know you're very plugged into going to conferences, reading the research. What are some of the recent trends or other exciting developments that you've run into in the last, 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And this is the stuff that I'm super passionate about now is exploring hormesis, or this concept of using little stressors to boost your resilience. And so an example of hormesis is what we call contrast therapy, or exploring using hot and cold. And that's the thing, is like a lot of these things already existed in our, traditional cultures, right? So, for example, what I do in my shower, like I'll take a nice hot shower, nice and cozy, feeling good, getting the blood flowing, and then I will turn it to freezing cold for the last minute, right? So that because there's a lot of science that shows when you stress your body in ways that it can handle, right? It actually boosts your resilience. It rewires your autonomic nervous system. It triggers the release of a lot of healing compounds and neurotransmitters, so on and so forth. Ever since I started doing that several years ago, one thing I've always been really sensitive to, like cold wind.
Huh.
Like I remember in the past, like if I go swimming and get out of the pool, if there was cold wind, It was literally guaranteed that I would come down with a terrible cold the next day. It just knocked me out.
But I bet because of your therapy with the cold, that doesn't
Oh,
happen anymore.
exactly.
You
After
fixed
3 years doing this, like I remember we were in Lake Tahoe. We live in Northern California. We're at the Lake Tahoe, and I got in the water and I got a little paranoid. I'm like, wait a second, it's kind of cold and it's windy. Maybe I shouldn't do this. But I'm like, no, I got this, right? And because of that training the nervous system. But the cool thing is that type of thing you can also apply to the treatment of things like Alzheimer's, dementia, and concussion. But here's the caveat. Pro tip, because these are stressors, and hormesis is this idea where you're introducing small stressors, but the word small is relative, right? So when I was in the throes of my concussion, like struggling, barely able to get out of bed, big stressors like turning the water freezing cold would actually throw my nervous system into overdrive. So for me, I didn't just like wake up one day and start doing that. I eased into it, right? And so, like, for example, before I got to freezing cold, what I'd first do is I turn it lukewarm. I'm like, it was more kind of like, that doesn't feel good, but it wasn't like a super shock to my body. So that's the key. Hormesis, there's a lot of research looking into that and how it can boost resilience, reverse the aging process. And by the way, I'm sure a lot of speakers will talk about this on the summit.
Oh yeah, no,
I looking at Alzheimer's as like actually a disease of aging, and aging as a quote unquote disease, meaning if we can reverse the aging process, we can then stop, and sometimes reverse these neurodegenerative processes. But my point is, a lot of the research is showing how one of the tools we have is hormesis. So example, like this contrast therapy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the way I think of hormesis is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly.
And to your point, you want to start slow and slow. Yeah.
That's what I've learned, having been through it myself as a concussion survivor and working with patients who are more sensitive. It's like this one man's like medicine, even if it's the same exact thing at the wrong dosage, could be another woman's poison, as an example, right? Sure. So I've learned it's like really important to figure out not only do the right thing, patch up the right hole in your roof, but patch it up in the right order, right? So start with this hole over here first, then this one, you get the best results, but also making sure that you do it in the right amounts. With that's pretty much like my 1, 2, 3 punch, right? Yeah. Right thing, right order, right amount, remove the things that the brain doesn't need, and healing is possible.
That is so exciting. Wow. Titus, we've covered so many amazing concepts and topics here. What would you say are 3 or 4 of the most important ones that the viewers should take away with?
Yeah. So number one, we kind of alluded to this at the start, right? Things like Alzheimer's and dementia, you don't wake up with it one day. It's this long going process for the majority of people over the course of 20, sometimes 30 years, maybe even longer, right? Now that might be terrifying to some, but for me, that's like, oh my goodness, there are so many opportunities to make a change now, today, not 20, 30 years from now, when perhaps you've already been diagnosed. And the thing is, even the latest research shows that even in the end stage game of that, there's still always hope for some type of improvement. But what I found is the sooner you take action when it comes to your brain, the better. So that's like, I think the number one thing, right?
Agreed.
Number 2, it's like these little things. Sure, there's advanced treatments that can jumpstart your brain. I offer them, but I also learn that some of these things you can just do in the comfort and convenience of your own home, installing these things. And so if people out there feel overwhelmed by watching, all these videos and all these tips, just find what you're most drawn to and start there, right? One step at a time. And finally, number 3, never give up hope.
That's awesome. Wow. And Titus, do you have a website? How can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So brainsave.com is my website. Also, I'm on Instagram as well as Facebook. And for those of you out there who are curious to find out if you do have a leaky brain, I also designed a quiz, leakybrainquiz.com. You can get free access to that quiz to assess your risk for leaky brain and what you can do about it.
That's great. And what if someone wants to reach out to you directly? I mean, you're in lots of different places. What's the most efficient way to reach you directly?
Sure. So if people are actually interested in working with me one-on-one or in a group setting, go to brainsave.com/apply and fill out the form. And we review each and every one of those forms. My team will get back to you with the best next steps.
Wow. Titus, thank you so much, not only for agreeing to do this interview and your knowledge, but frankly, moving this whole field forward, the books you've written, and how you turned what was a personal challenge over many years that you were able to fix. You're now basically giving back to other people. I love that story.
Yeah, thanks so much too, Dr. Josh. It's always a pleasure. I love chatting with you, especially about the brain. We love it, right? It's our jam. So I
It's
appreciate the opportunity to share this message of hope and healing to everybody watching this video.
Thanks again, Titus.